3 decades ago.
Right, makes sense.
I need now. So
Right.
it is understandable. A little frustrating because you want to demonstrate. Look, boss, this is nothing new. Right? This is a repeated pattern that we're seeing here, but they're more interested in the here and now.
So did they have repeated footage? Because you're saying 3 decades, but obviously we're talking about 1950. Did they have stuff from the 1980s, stuff from the 1990s?
There was reporting, yeah. And again, I got to be careful because some of that stuff I haven't been cleared to talk about, but there are reports we call foreign intelligence, FI, foreign intelligence reports, and I can't say where or who or anything like that, but on classified systems where we know without a shadow of a doubt UAPs were encountered in other countries, adversarial countries. Why? Because we spy on them and we know. Again, I can't say how we know and whatnot because I can get in trouble, but just...
So we know this is not a United States phenomenon.
Precisely. It is not a U.S.-only phenomenon. And in fact, in other countries, whether it's in Latin America, South America, or in Europe, or Russia, China, there is an extreme interest in this topic. In fact, the Chinese, it was in the newspaper, I think it was the China Morning Sun, they have something called the 5 Continents Initiative, where allegedly they were trying to broker a deal with the United Nations that would allow China to run all the UFO investigations for the United Nations. Right. So we also know that Russia, they've come out and said, yeah, we're interested in this topic. There was some released old KGB footage that showed MiG interactions with these UAP. And there's also in Latin America, you have the same thing. If you go to Latin America now, they don't have the same level of stigma and taboo associated with this topic like we do. And so they talk freely about it. They have no problem talking. In fact, when I was in the Patagonia area of Argentina, there is near a town called Bariloche and Las Lajas. One of the chief of police was telling me there's an area there called La Miranda. La Miranda means to see, to view. And they call it that, the town, and because UAP are so frequent there that local law enforcement actually built an observatory, an observation post to look at these things because they were so frequent. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been around for quite a long time. The problem is, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, but this is my assessment, the reason why it's so difficult to have the conversation here is because our government had placed so much emphasis and interest trying to stigmatize this topic that it almost worked too well. Now we're at the point where we should be having this conversation and people still don't want to because they think it's crazy. You think of tinfoil hats and Elvis on the mothership, when in reality, we're talking about a real national security issue. I mean, these things are here. You have, Joe, you have a former director of national intelligence, Radcliffe, a former director of CIA, Brennan. You have former presidents all coming out and saying, yeah, there's something to it. It's real, right? Now, what it is, where it's from and all that stuff, I'm not sure we're quite ready to go there yet. But the acknowledgement is, hey, man, yeah, this is real. It's not ours. And we probably should do something about it.
So if we go back to the history of the debunking of it, like the Project Blue Book stuff, J. Allen Hynek, after he had left Project Blue Book, he became a proponent of UFO disclosure. During Project Blue Book, it was his job to essentially dismiss everything and to come up with some sort of a reason, swamp gas, mass hallucinations, whatever it was, to attribute all these sightings to something that was very easy to explain. Did they ever is there any documentation or any discussion of why they did that, why they chose to debunk everything?
Yeah, my understanding is if you have to look at where America was at the time they were doing these investigations. It was at the height of the Cold War, right? And, despite what some people think, the Cold War wasn't very cold at all. It was pretty hot. And we had Russia and the United States engaging in these proxy wars. Neither side wanted to let the other side know what we had and what we didn't know, right? So if you have these UAP coming in and out, the last thing you want to do is tell the other side, broadcast, this is what we've learned from it, and more importantly, this is what we don't know about it, right? And so both sides were keeping this very quiet, but there was an interesting agreement at the classified level, I believe in the late 60s, where there was this relationship with the United States. We were putting up our Northern Tier radar system to detect then Soviet Union ICBMs, and they were doing the same thing, right? Because none of us really trusted each other. But we trusted each other enough to say, look, before you hit that button, if you see something coming over the horizon, before you hit that button and launch, give us a call because it might be a UFO, right? And we don't want to start World War III because either side mistakes a UFO for an ICBM.
Right.
And that's how serious they took the topic. I mean, that's real. That's a real memo that existed between the United States and Russia. So that is an indicator how much both sides took this topic seriously.
Jesus. And so when Philip Corso was dismissing all these different things, did they have anything, any film footage, any stuff from that time, from Project Blue Book, that was like definitively not ours?
I'm not privy to. Well, I'm aware of the fact that people say it does exist and people have been briefed on it. I wasn't privy to that. I was, again, more focused on the here and now.
Right.
I was aware of people who had attended certain meetings, very senior level meetings where that was discussed, where they saw certain footage. But I'm hearing that secondhand. I did not see the old footage. My focus was more on the current, what's going on now. But back to your point, why was this effort to try to create so much stigma and taboo? I think it was because of that. I think because you had Russia and U.S. at this weird stalemate where neither one wanted to tell the other side what we know and what we didn't know about UAP. And I think the focus from a national security perspective, let's say you're a general and I'm a general, look, we've got a real Cold War going on here right now. As long as these things aren't coming in and zapping my people, that's going to be my focus right now. That's a real potential threat that I have to deal with now. I've got Russia pointing nukes at me and I'm pointing nukes at them. At any time we could launch. Let's focus on that more
Right.
so than the other stuff. And that has been my observation on why they didn't want to address the problem, the challenge, openly with the general public back. And they also were worried. There was several studies that suggested that most people would be very uncomfortable with that idea that there's something else in the cosmos potentially, or even right here on Earth, and that it would create some sort of societal disruption, right? They didn't want to cause panic. They were afraid that people would kind of like think of a run on Wall Street, right? When people get panicked, they do kind of strange things sometimes. And I think the government was very worried about that.
What's the most compelling modern thing that you've seen?
Oh my God, I can't talk about it, unfortunately. This is my frustration, Joe, because I know what I've seen. I know what my colleagues have seen, right? And to this day, there's video that's coming in on a regular and routine basis that is very, very compelling. And if
How do they hide this stuff from the general public?
Well, we have classified systems. We hide a lot
Right,
of
but
things.
how is it getting filmed? Is any of it getting filmed by the general public, or is all this military stuff?
So let me backtrack a little bit. There's a general public that is filming stuff, but from a Department of Defense perspective, our focus now. Aero is a different story, but when I was in the government, we had to be very, very careful of something we called intelligence oversight. Back in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, particularly in the Department of Defense, was kind of naughty. They were doing things they shouldn't do. They were spying on students and they were spying on American citizens.
You
and they were
don't
doing
say.
things. Yeah,
Crazy.
Right? Say it isn't so. So Congress passed some laws and said, okay, you can no longer do this kind of stuff on American citizens, right? You can't conduct intelligence operations on American citizens. You can't do it. It's illegal, right?
Okay.
So you have Executive Order 12333 and all these other rules and laws and DOD 5240.1 that all come out and say no mas. So Department of Defense is supposed to focus on military. That's it. You don't bring in U.S. persons' information and ingest them into a Department of Defense database, especially a Department of Defense intelligence database. That's a super no-no. That's called U.S. persons information, and it's pretty much verboten. So our focus was looking specifically at military-sourced information. I was not focusing at all on what the private citizens were seeing because at the end of the day, we couldn't use it. You can't do anything with
And
the
it
data.
seems like you got plenty of compelling footage from the military.
Overwhelming. There's absolutely no doubt that we didn't have to look at civilian data because we had better collection sensor systems from the military that was looking at stuff and giving us better insight.
If you can't tell us about, can you give us some sort of an understanding of like what you're talking about
Yeah, sure.
without being specific?
Yeah, let me see. Okay, yeah. There is a video, high-resolution video, of I can't say what platform it was taken from. I can't say where it was taken from.
Okay.
But an object that do you know how large an offshore oil derrick is? They're huge, right?
Yeah.
They're like almost like a small city, right? They're like one city block. They're huge. They're enormous things. There is a video that shows one of these objects underwater that goes by. The speed was calculated between 450 and 550 knots underwater, and it was bigger than the offshore derrick that it was passing, because you could see in the video the offshore derrick, and you could see this thing zip right by it.
Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of them, right? A lot of them are reported as being transmedium.
Right. So that exactly. Why do we use the term UAP, right? Now it's unidentified anomalous phenomenon, because it's all domain. Initially it was UFO, unidentified flying object. And for several reasons they changed the name. One of them, not just because of stigma like people think, but because the word flying object means flight. And
Right.
you have to have wings to fly. That's flight. And these things don't have wings. So that term, we're not even sure is even accurate anymore, because they're not necessarily flying. We see them underwater. We see them super high altitude. So the term was changed to unidentified aerial phenomenon. But again, that did not encompass all the observations we were seeing. So now the term UAP, I think the latest description of it is unidentified anomalous phenomenon, to help describe this multi-domain or transmedium characteristic that we are beginning to see and record that these things can do. And that is, I'm going to, if I can digress for a second, because that's super important, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
We have transmedium vehicles, right? We have things like seaplanes, and it's a plane and it can float on water. But let's face it, a seaplane is neither a really good plane or a really good boat, because it's a compromise. It's a design compromise between an object that you want to perform in the air and in the sea. And that's why it's neither really good at both. Same thing with, for example, the space shuttle. It goes out into space and it can glide down, but it's not a very good airplane, comes down like a brick,
Right.
because there's design compromises and performance compromises. But what we are seeing doesn't have any of that attributable compromise. It's not, these objects aren't slowing down. They're not changing their performance capabilities. They can do the same thing that we're seeing in the air and possibly in space and even underwater. So that is a fundamentally different type of technology than we are used to dealing with.
Is the assumption that they are doing something with space-time and gravity around them, rather than using something like a jet propulsion engine that blasts fire out the back and it makes it go fast forward?
Right.
That they're doing something that alters the gravity around them.
Yeah. So
and that's why they can go through everything.
Yeah. So we had some of the best scientists on the team, folks like Dr. Hal Puthoff and some other folks that I'm not allowed to say their names, Dr. Eric Davis and some others, that were doing the calculations, mathematical calculations on how this is possible. And the consensus was by the scientists, not me, because I'm not a physics expert, I'm not a astrophysicist. They were saying that, so let me back up here. Initially, the government for years was trying to identify the different exotic technologies that could explain the different performance characteristics. And it was during the ATIP years that the scientists had this consensus that if you had one type of technology, if you could do one thing, all these other observables now become possible. Kind of think of like a unifying theory. And so if you had the ability to create this bubble around you in a localized area that insulated you from the effects of Earth's gravity. Now, what is gravity? People think that, when I drop my glasses, that's gravity. That's not gravity. That's an effect of gravity. Gravity is the warping of space-time. And that's important because people you hear the term thrown around a lot, but they don't realize that space and time are actually connected. They are one and the same. They're opposite sides, if you will, of the same coin. And so you can't have one without the other. And so you have this ability to create a bubble around you that insulates you from the warping of space-time, let's say in this case Earth's gravity or something like that. Then the way you experience time inside that bubble is perhaps fundamentally different than the way you might experience space-time outside that bubble, because you're not subject to the effects of gravity, which would explain potentially why things don't need wings and why they don't need propulsion systems like that, right? So it's a completely different way of looking at how we understand physics and how we as humans move about. Everything we do is fundamentally force equals mass times acceleration. Right? F equals ma, right? Mass times acceleration, and you get force. This may be something a little bit different. This is not using, again, conventional thrust, or if I, Newtonian, right? If I push this way, I have an equal and opposite reaction that way, right? That's how.
Are there any theories as to how it's accomplishing this?
There is. Actually, Dr. Hal Puthoff about 3 years ago gave a speech on this, a very interesting lecture about this technology. And if you ever have the chance, you really should have him on, because he's an incredible human being. He's also the one who helped start the government's remote viewing program and a bunch of other stuff for the government. He's been involved in a lot of our nation's probably most classified efforts. But he was working with us on ATIP as one of our scientists. And he gave a lecture about 3 years ago to some other scientists about the specifics on how this is possible. I am not a scientist, so I'm definitely not going to speak on behalf of Hal Puthoff, because I'm sure I will muck it up. But I do recall a time when he came into our skiff and gave us about a 3-hour lecture on this unifying theory. And at that moment, it was very much for us the epiphany that a lot of us had been searching for. He's like, look, at the end of the day, this is how it's possible. And that was kind of this, wow. So it's really not.
Can you give us a moron's
magic
view of how it's possible?
Yeah.
Explain it to someone like me.
Yeah, well, I'm in that category, Joe. So,
Good. We're speaking the same language.
Yes, sir. Yeah, single syllable grunts, right? Yeah. So you have an object like this cup on your table, and you want it to be insulated from the effects of Earth's gravity. So you create this bubble artificially using a certain energetic source at a certain frequency, and it interacts with certain material, certain metamaterial. And I got to be careful exactly what I say, but certain skin of the craft, this aluminum via the cup here, and all of a sudden, whoop, you have this bubble around you where what you see on the outside is not necessarily what you see on the inside. In fact, may I do it?
Sure.
One more drawing
Yeah.
for you? Okay, and forgive me, I'm not an artist, so I'm going to do this upside down for you, and then I'm going to kind of scoot this just a little here. All right, let's do this. So, unfortunately, I know your audience can't see this, but actually,
That's
probably
okay.
good.
Some people can. There's a video form of it.
Well,
I'm sure this will get on. It'll be on YouTube as well.
It's probably good that they don't, because I'm not an artist. But
Okay.
let's say this is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional space,
Okay.
and in essence,
So what you've done is essentially you created a three-dimensional looking grid stacked. It looked like stacked boxes on top of each other.
yeah, right. And so you have location A and location B.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say I go from Los Angeles to Baltimore.
Okay.
And it takes me 5 hours to fly at 500 miles an hour. That's a function of distance over time. And in essence, you can mark that linearly like this. So I fly, it takes me 5 hours, there I am.
Okay.
If you had the ability to compress space-time, and not a lot, just a little bit, and you were able to allow these points to be a little closer together, now in essence, what took you, let's say, 5 hours and 500 miles an hour to do it, you can do it in 1 hour, and you can do it in much less time. But to the observer outside, because we're still in the same universe, we would see something like that. We would see this incredible hopscotching ability to, if you will, take a shortcut through space-time. And so what would appear to be instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity, and other things, now becomes a reality. And so that is fundamentally what these scientists had discovered. And so it seems like science fiction, but when you understand the mathematics and some of the theorem that they've proposed, a lot of these other observables become possible.
So these are essentially just theoretical explanations of how these things are moving.
Yeah, and I'm not a scientist.
I
I want to be
understand.
very careful. I don't want to misrepresent anything. There's a whole lot of other stuff that, if you can do that, all of a sudden now makes sense and may describe the observations that people are seeing and why they're kind of hard to see and they seem obscure.
Right.
And so I think from a governmental perspective, that it was kind of a revelatory moment for the folks in our program.
So they realized one of the reasons why these things are weird looking is because they're creating. You want a light?
Do you mind? I'm sorry.
Yeah, take this.
Thank you.
So the back thing, the other side. Push that down. There you go. Bam.
Thank you very much.
No problem. So how much of this is theoretical and how much of this is observed from recovered vehicles?
I am not allowed to talk about what the government may or may not have in its possession, other than that so I went through a very lengthy Pentagon review process. Recently, I wrote, I won't talk about it here, but I wrote something. And I had to go through Pentagon to have a review process. And it took almost a year. In this thing I wrote, I talk about up to the part I can talk about. Mm-hmm. And they approved for me to talk about up to that point. When it comes to what the government may or may not have in its possession, all I can simply say is that there is very compelling evidence to suggest that the U.S. government is in absolute possession of exotic material that is not made by humans. Now, beyond that, I can't really expound upon. I haven't been given permission to talk about it. But what I can say is what I've already said for the record, which has been approved by the Pentagon. I won't get in trouble by saying it. Mm-hmm. Is that we are there's very compelling data to suggest that we are in possession of.
Why is the Pentagon teasing us? Why do they tell you? Why are they allowing you to say we are in possession of something that was not made by human beings, but not allowed to elaborate, not allowed to show these very compelling videos that you're talking about that you've seen?
I don't. Well, two reasons. I don't think they have a choice. I think with now the introduction of cell phones and Ring cameras, the cat's out of the bag. It's the worst kept secret at this point. Two, there is a faction, unlike before in the Cold War, I believe there is a faction of people inside the government that do want this conversation to occur. But equally, there's still a faction of people that are very mad with me. They do not want me having this conversation. And mark my words, just by me being on your show, it is going to cause an absolute storm inside the Pentagon, and I am sure the other shoe is going to drop. I promise you, you're going to hear all sorts of stuff. People make stuff up about me trying to discredit this topic, because as many people are in the government that want this topic to be discussed now, there's still some people that do not want this conversation.
Could you steelman their position?
Say again?
Steelman their position, meaning could you argue it from their perspective?
Absolutely.
Like why?
Sure.
What would be a good reason to keep this stuff quiet?
Sure. And I want to preface here, I'm not fear mongering.
No, I don't think you are.
Look, if I was a military person, right, I would look at this from the perspective of there's three options. They're good, they're neutral, or they're bad. So let's go down this road for a second. Let's say good, right? Well, okay. We got nothing to worry about. The problem is there's nothing to suggest that they truly are benevolent. People say, well, they're like, they don't want us to nuke ourselves. Well, I discuss it in what I wrote, that there's no data to suggest that. They didn't stop us from dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and vaporizing 500,000 living souls. They didn't stop us when we started developing nuclear weapons from the atomic age. They didn't stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. They didn't stop the testing in the Nevada range of atomic and nuclear weapons. And now, how many countries have atomic weapons and nuclear weapons? A lot, right? They didn't stop Chernobyl. They didn't stop Fukushima. They didn't stop 3 Mile Island. So to say that they're here to help us, I'm not sure there's data. People say, well, in Minot and North Dakota and Montana, the UFOs came in and they interfered with our nuclear weapons, and they brought the entire Echo flight offline, which, by the way, I have the government report on that if you want it. But in Russia, a lot of people don't know, they turned them on. Right? So that's equally scary. They're interfering with our nuclear capability, whether to attack or to defend ourselves.
So when you say they turned them on in Russia, this is a Russian report?
Yeah. So this is I don't know if you remember the congressional hearing that occurred last year where
with David Grush?
Nope, the other one, with Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence Ronald Moultrie and some people from the Navy. And I think it was Congressman Gallagher that asked the very specific question. And he said, are you aware of UFOs interfering with our nuclear capabilities? And the response was something like, no, I'm not really familiar with it, never heard of it. And then the question was, I think, re-asked specifically at these locations. And the government's response was, no, not familiar with it. Well, here's the actual report from the Department of Defense. This is the actual intelligence report that was released through FOIA. There's a gentleman out there who runs a site called the Black Vault. His name is John Greenwald. He's probably the world authority on Freedom of Information Act. And he has a wealth of data that is out available to the public that he has received from the government. This is one of those documents. This is the document that our own government has no idea apparently exists.
I like how they write it in all caps.
Yeah, that's the old reporting.
So obviously there's some people that don't want this to be released, and obviously there's some people that think that the general public has a right to know.
I believe so. That's been my observations and my experience.
Well, that makes sense. You know, I mean, like when everybody says the CIA does this, like, okay, who?
Well,
who in the CIA?
I didn't
right?
finish though the other part, right? So if they're not here for if it's not friendly,
right,
that leaves them neutral like us,
right, or benevolent.
Benevolent. Now, from a military perspective, and I just want to caveat, I don't agree with this, but I can respect the understanding. You, sir, are a general, and I say to you, we cannot prove that they're not here to do something bad. But what we do know is that they can interfere. They're very interested in our military capabilities, and they have interfered with our nuclear capabilities, right? Mm-hmm. From a military perspective, that looks an awful lot like something we call IPB, Initial Preparations of the Battle Space, or perhaps even ISR, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. Whenever we're going to go into a foreign country and invade, we do long-range surveillance. We want to know how the enemy operates, how they react. So even if there's a 2% chance, 5% chance that these things are here to do something malevolent, right, mm-hmm. then we probably should not tip our hands to the fact that we are aware of it publicly, because what happens the moment that the bad guys in a foreign country find our surveillance team over the border? We've got 12 hours. We got to invade, because the element of surprise is now over. So some may feel in the government the mere fact of acknowledging this, if there is some sort of malintent, may push up artificially a clock that exists somewhere for these things to say, okay, the foolish humans are now, the cat's out of the bag. They know we're here. We need to go in now for whatever reason they may have. So that is the military mindset potentially of some of these individuals who want to keep this secret.
So they're worried about an actual invasion.
Well, but they have to be. That is
right,
that is the role of our national security
right.
apparatus, right? Even if there's a 1% chance,
right.
they have to consider that in their planning and in their decision-making matrix. So again, going back to what I said, I respect that. I don't agree with it, but I can respect that. If that is the reason why, then I would say, okay, look, in your heart, you really do have the best interests of the American people. You are a patriot. I can accept that. Again, I don't think it's your decision to make. I think it needs to go to Congress. I think it needs to go to the president. Let the American people decide. I think America can handle the truth. I think America deserves the truth, and let the American people decide if it's in their best interest to know more about this. I agree with
you, but I also could see it from their perspective. Like, they're probably insanely busy already, and the last thing they want to do is get involved in this thing where now they have a PR campaign when they're trying to let people know about this thing and not cause mass panic.
That's right. That's right. But you know what, though? I'm also very optimistic, Joe,